He was buried with full honors, but his dog never believed he was gone. The morning air hung cold and still over the cemetery, the kind of quiet that settles deep into your bones, where even the wind seems to hold its breath out of respect. Rows of white headstones stretched across the rolling green like silent witnesses, each one carrying a story the world had already moved on from. But today, one story refused to end. At the center of it stood a single figure that did not belong to grief the way the others did. Shadow, a German shepherd with a sable coat dulled by dust and time, stood rigid beside the freshly lowered casket, his amber eyes locked on the flag-draped wood as if staring hard enough might break it open and prove everyone wrong. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He didn't move. The Marines around him shifted uncomfortably, boots pressing into damp earth, dress blues sharp against the gray sky, but their discipline could not mask the tension in their silence. They had seen dogs before, loyal, trained, obedient, but this was something else. Something heavier. Something that felt almost knowing. The chaplain's voice drifted across the gathering, low and measured. Words about sacrifice and honor carried gently through the cool air, but Shadow did not react. Not to the voice. Not to the folded flag being prepared. Not even to the faint rustle of wind brushing against the trees lining the hill. His entire body was fixed on one thing only. The casket. As if the world beyond it no longer existed. A Marine standing a few feet back cleared his throat softly, glancing toward the handler at Shadow's side. "He hasn't moved in 10 minutes, he whispered, barely louder than the breeze. The handler gave a slow shake of his head, eyes never leaving the dog. "He's waiting." The word lingered there, strange and out of place. Waiting for what? The ceremony continued. The rifle salute cracked through the stillness, sharp and echoing across the hillside, but Shadow did not flinch. Not even a twitch. It was as if the sound never reached him. As if he stood somewhere else entirely, somewhere beyond this moment, beyond this grave. Then, just as the final note of the bugle began to rise, thin and haunting, something changed. It was small, almost invisible. A shift in his posture. His ears, once still, lifted slightly. His nose tilted into the air, drawing in a slow, deliberate breath. And for the first time since the ceremony began, a sound escaped him. Not a bark, not a growl, just a low, quiet rumble, deep in his chest, the kind of sound that didn't belong to fear, but to recognition. The handler stiffened. "Shadow," he murmured under his breath. But the dog didn't look at him, didn't look at anyone. His gaze remained fixed on the casket, unblinking, unwavering, as if he could hear something no one else could. As if, beneath the weight of wood and earth and silence, there was still something alive. And in that moment, as the bugle's final note trembled into the sky, the entire field seemed to hold its breath, because somehow, impossibly, the dog was not mourning. He was waiting for his Marine to come back. The silence did not end when the ceremony was over. It only changed shape, settling heavier into the air as people began to leave in slow, respectful steps, shoes brushing softly against the damp grass, voices lowered as if afraid to disturb something sacred that had not yet finished unfolding. But Shadow did not follow them. He did not respond when his handler gave the first gentle command, nor the second. His body remained planted beside the fresh earth, muscles steady, eyes still fixed on the place where the casket had disappeared, as though time itself had stopped for him. And somewhere deep in that stillness, the past began to move again, not as memory alone, but as something alive, something unfinished, because there had been another morning, not cold and quiet like this one, but sharp with heat and light, the kind that pressed against your skin and made the horizon shimmer. And on that morning Lucas Hayes had stood with Shadow at his side, boots planted in pale dust, the air, carrying the faint scent of metal and sun-baked earth, his hand resting just briefly against the dog's neck in a gesture so small no one else noticed. But Shadow had felt it, the calm, the trust, the unspoken promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. Lucas had always moved with that quiet certainty, the kind that did not need to be spoken out loud, and Shadow had learned it early, learned that a shift in posture meant more than a shouted command, that a single breath could carry instruction, that loyalty was not trained into him but built, moment by moment, through every shared step and every silent understanding. They had walked miles like that, through training grounds and long patrol routes, through early mornings when the sky was still pale and evenings when the light faded into gold, always in sync, always aware of each other in a way that made words unnecessary. And sometimes Lucas would crouch beside him, pressing his forehead lightly against the dog's, whispering something too quiet for anyone else to hear, something that never needed repeating because Shadow remembered it all the same. And even now, standing in the cemetery with the wind brushing faintly against his coat, those moments did not feel like something lost. They felt close, just beneath the surface, as if they were waiting for the right moment to return. A Marine passing by slowed as he noticed the dog still standing there, glancing toward the handler with a question in his eyes. But the handler only shook his head again, softer this time, because he had seen this kind of bond before and knew better than to break it too soon. He knows something, the Marine muttered quietly, more to himself than anyone else, and the handler did not answer, because there was no answer that would make sense of what they were witnessing, only the quiet certainty that this was not over, not for the dog, not for the story, not yet. And as the last of the footsteps faded and the cemetery returned to stillness, Shadow lowered his head slightly, drawing in another slow breath, deeper this time, as if searching through layers of earth and memory and distance for something that should not still be there. And for a brief second, so brief it could have been missed entirely, his tail gave the faintest movement, not of grief, but of recognition, as though somewhere beyond sight and beyond reason, he could still feel the presence of the one person who had never truly left him. They told the story in pieces, never all at once, as if even memory had learned to be careful with what it revealed, because the day Lucas Hayes was declared gone did not begin with silence. It began with routine, with sunlight stretching across a dusty outpost and the low hum of generators in the background, the kind of morning that felt ordinary enough to trust. Lucas had moved through it with the same quiet focus he always carried, checking gear, adjusting straps, his movements steady and practiced, while Shadow stayed close at his side, alert but calm, reading every shift in his handler without needing to be told. There had been no warning in the air that anyone could point to later, nothing dramatic, nothing that would explain why everything changed in a matter of moments. Only a subtle tension that Shadow felt before anyone else did. A pause in Lucas's step, a slight tightening of his hand against the dog's collar, the kind of instinct that comes from surviving things no one talks about. And then the world tilted, not with noise or chaos, but with confusion, with voices calling out, with movement breaking the rhythm of the day in a way that did not belong. Shadow reacted first, his body lowering, ears forward, eyes searching for the source of what felt wrong rather than what looked wrong. Lucas turned, scanning, his voice calm but sharper now, giving a command that cut through the rising tension, and Shadow obeyed instantly. Because that was what they did. They trusted, they moved as one, even when the situation did not yet make sense. But then Lucas stepped forward, just a few feet, just enough to shift the distance between them. And that was the moment everything fractured, not in violence, but in separation. In the sudden absence of the one presence Shadow was built to follow, there was a flash of movement, a blur of figures, orders shouted too quickly to process. And when Shadow lunged forward, driven by instinct to close that gap, hands caught his harness, firm, unyielding, holding him back as Lucas disappeared beyond his reach. Stay. The command came, clear, unmistakable, the same word that had guided him through countless moments before, and Shadow froze, because obedience was not a choice. It was a promise, his body trembling with the effort of holding still while everything inside him pushed to break forward. His eyes locked on the place where Lucas had been, waiting for him to return, because he always did, because that was how it worked. But this time the space remained empty, filled only with unfamiliar movement and voices that did not carry the same weight. Minutes stretched into something longer, something heavier, until the command that had held him in place became something else, something unanswered. And when they finally released him, when the grip on his harness loosened and the path ahead was clear again, he surged forward without hesitation, nose low, searching, tracking, refusing to accept the absence as final. But there was no clear trail, no familiar signal, only fragments that did not lead anywhere. And for the first time since he had been paired with Lucas, The world did not make sense. The bond that had always guided him now pulled in every direction at once. And even as the handlers called him back, even as the structure of training tried to reassert itself, something deeper had already shifted, because Shadow was not just following commands anymore. He was looking for someone who had never failed to come back before, and somewhere between that moment and the quiet hill where he now stood, the world had decided the story was over, but Shadow had not, and standing there beside the fresh earth, with the wind brushing faintly against his coat, he held on to the last command he had ever been given, not as obedience, but as belief, because to him, stay had never meant remain behind. It had always meant wait until I return. They tried to move him before the sun dipped below the horizon, when the light turned softer and the shadows stretched long across the grass. But Shadow would not leave, not when the air still carried something unfinished. His handler finally stepping closer with slower movements now, less command and more understanding, boots pressing gently into the earth as he crouched beside the dog. "Come on, boy," he said quietly, not as an order but as a request, his hand hovering just above Shadow's neck before resting there, firm but patient. Yet Shadow did not respond the way he once would have. There was no immediate shift, no automatic compliance, only a stillness that felt deeper than training. His eyes remained fixed forward, his body grounded as if anchored to something no one else could see, and the handler exhaled slowly, glancing toward the others who had lingered at a distance, uncertain whether to intervene or simply bear witness, because this was no longer about discipline. It was about something that did not fit neatly into commands. "He has to come with us," one of the Marines said softly. Though even he did not sound convinced, the handler nodded but did not move to pull him away. Not yet, because he had seen this before in quieter ways, in dogs who waited at doors long after footsteps had faded, in eyes that searched crowds for faces that would never return, but never like this. Never this certain, never this resolved. Minutes passed in a silence that felt almost deliberate, as if time itself had chosen to slow down for this moment. And then, without warning, Shadow shifted, not backward, not away, but forward, one step closer to the fresh mound of earth, his nose lowering until it hovered just inches above the soil, drawing in a slow breath, deeper than before, as though he was reaching through layers of distance for something just out of reach. His ears flicked slightly, catching something no one else could hear, and for a brief second, his posture changed, not into grief, but into focus, the kind he used to have when Lucas would give him a signal no one else noticed. The handler felt it too, that subtle shift, his hand tightening slightly against the dog's fur. "Shadow," he murmured again, softer this time, and finally, the dog moved, but not in the way anyone expected. He turned his head just enough to glance back, not at the handler, not at the Marines, but toward the path leading away from the cemetery, his gaze steady, intent, as if something beyond the hill had just called to him. It was not confusion, it was direction, clear and certain, and then he looked back at the grave one last time, holding that moment for a breath longer than necessary, before stepping away on his own. No command given, no leash pulled, just a quiet decision that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training. The handler stood slowly, watching him go, a faint unease settling in his chest because this was not closure, this was not acceptance, this was something else entirely, something that felt like the beginning of a different path, one that none of them could see yet. And as Shadow walked toward the edge of the cemetery, the fading light catching along the line of his back, there was no hesitation in his stride, only purpose, as if the story everyone believed had ended beneath that soil had simply moved somewhere else, and he was the only one who knew where to find it. The road beyond the cemetery sloped gently downward, lined with old oak trees whose branches stretched wide like quiet guardians, their leaves whispering in the late afternoon breeze, and Shadow moved along it with steady purpose, each step measured, each breath deliberate, as if he were following something written into the air itself. The handler trailing several yards behind now, not pulling, not calling out again, only watching, because there was something about the way the dog carried himself that made interruption feel wrong, like speaking too loudly in a place meant for silence. The gravel shifted softly beneath Shadow's paws as he reached the edge of the paved road, where the scent of earth gave way to faint traces of oil, rubber, and distant movement. But he did not hesitate. His head lifted slightly, nose catching the currents of air that moved across the open space. And for a moment he stood completely still again, eyes focused not on what could be seen, but on something that had to be felt, something remembered, because somewhere far from this quiet hill, beyond the rows of stones and the finality they represented, another place existed where the story had not ended the way they believed, a place filled with sterile light and the low hum of machines, where time moved differently, slower, heavier, as if every second carried weight. And in that place, Lucas Hayes lay in a narrow bed near the far wall of a room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and something colder, something clinical, his body still, his breathing shallow but steady, monitored by quiet devices that blinked in soft intervals. He had been there longer than anyone outside those walls knew, kept away from the world that had already written his ending, his face thinner now, marked by time and distance rather than the sharp confidence it once held. But even in that stillness, there was something unchanged, something that refused to let go, his hand resting loosely at his side, fingers twitching ever so slightly as if reaching for something just beyond his grasp, as if remembering without fully waking. And back on the road, miles away, Shadow's ears lifted again, his body shifting forward with renewed certainty, because whatever distance separated them was not enough to break what had been built between them. The handler finally closed the gap by a few steps, his voice low and cautious. "Where are you going, boy?" But Shadow did not look back this time. He stepped off the edge of the road onto a narrow path that cut through a stretch of dry grass, one that led away from the familiar and into something unknown. His stride neither rushed nor hesitant, just certain, and the handler followed, slower, unsure but unwilling to stop him now, because this was no longer about bringing the dog back. It was about understanding what he seemed to know. The sun dipped lower behind them, casting long shadows that stretched ahead like quiet invitations. And as the distance between the cemetery and the path grew, so did the feeling that something unseen was pulling the story forward, not toward an ending, but toward something waiting to be found, something that had never fully been lost. And though no one else could see it yet, Shadow moved as if he already knew exactly where it was. The path narrowed as it pushed through the dry grass, bending slightly under Shadow's weight, the world around him growing quieter with each step as the distant sounds of traffic and voices faded into something softer, something less certain, and the handler followed at a careful distance, his boots brushing against the brittle stems, his breath steady but his thoughts anything but, because this was no longer a trained route, no longer a familiar perimeter or command-driven movement. This was instinct, pure and unwavering, and it led somewhere he could not yet understand. Shadow's pace remained consistent, not hurried, not hesitant, just driven by a purpose that did not need explanation. His nose lifted now and then, catching fragments carried on the wind, fragments that meant nothing to anyone else but everything to him. And far away, in that quiet room where time seemed to stretch thin, Lucas lay unchanged to the outside eye, the soft rhythm of machines marking each breath with quiet precision, the light above him dimmed to a steady glow that never fully shifted between day and night. And yet something within that stillness stirred, not visibly, not enough to call attention, but enough to exist, enough to ripple beneath the surface like a memory trying to rise. His fingers twitched again, faint, almost imperceptible, curling slightly as though reaching for something that was not there, something that should have been. And back on the path, Shadow slowed for the first time, his ears angling forward, his body tightening just enough to signal a change. The handler noticed it immediately, his own steps faltering as he watched the dog's posture shift into something sharper, more focused, the kind of alertness that came before a discovery, before a moment that mattered. "What is it?" he murmured under his breath. Though he knew the question would go unanswered, Shadow took another step, then another, until the path opened onto a narrow service road that ran alongside a low building set back behind a line of chain-link fencing, the structure plain, almost forgettable, its walls a muted gray that blended into the evening light. No sign drawing attention, no indication of what lay inside, just a quiet presence that felt deliberately unnoticed. Shadow stopped at the edge of the road, his gaze locking onto the building with an intensity that made the handler's chest tighten, because there was no hesitation now, no uncertainty, only recognition. The dog's body leaned forward slightly, as if pulled by something unseen, his tail low but steady, his breathing slow and controlled. And then he moved again, crossing the road without waiting, heading straight toward the fence. The handler quickened his pace now, calling out softly, "Shadow, wait." But the word carried no authority anymore, not in this moment, because whatever guided the dog was stronger than any command. Shadow reached the fence and stopped, his nose pressing close to the metal links, drawing in a deep breath that seemed to settle something inside him, something that had been searching since the moment he left the cemetery. And for the first time since all of this began, he let out a sound, not loud, not urgent, but certain, a low, steady rumble that carried recognition rather than confusion. And inside the building, beyond walls and distance and everything that should have separated them, Lucas's hand shifted again, just slightly, as if answering something he could not hear, but somehow still felt. And the space between them, once filled with absence, now held something else entirely, something fragile, impossible, and yet undeniable. The fence rattled softly under the pressure of Shadow's breath, the cold metal humming faintly as his nose pressed against it again and again, drawing in the scent that had pulled him across distance and doubt without hesitation. And behind him the handler finally reached the edge of the road, his chest rising heavier now, not from the walk, but from the growing certainty that this was no coincidence, that whatever stood beyond that fence was connected to something far deeper than instinct alone. "Shadow," he called again, quieter this time, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile thread had formed. But the dog did not turn, did not even acknowledge the sound, his entire focus locked onto the building beyond, his body still except for the slow rise and fall of his breath. And then, without warning, he let out a single bark, sharp and clear, not frantic, not aggressive, but precise, like a signal sent rather than a reaction given. The sound cut through the stillness of the evening and echoed faintly against the flat gray walls, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause, even the wind, even the distant hum of the road behind them, as if the world itself had heard it and was waiting to see what would follow. Inside the building, beneath the steady glow of artificial light, something shifted in the quiet rhythm of the room, not enough to trigger alarms or draw immediate attention, but enough to exist, enough to matter. Lucas's breathing changed, just slightly, the steady pattern, interrupted for a brief second before settling again, his fingers curling more noticeably now, the smallest movement, but real, undeniably real, as if something beyond the walls had reached him, not through sound or sight, but through something older, something built long before this moment. And back at the fence, Shadow's ears lifted higher, his body leaning forward as if he felt the response, as if the space between them had narrowed in a way no one else could measure. He barked again, this time softer, almost questioning, and then he went still, waiting. The handler stepped closer now, stopping just behind him, his eyes moving from the dog to the building and back again, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, of what he was feeling, because there was no logical explanation for the certainty radiating from the animal in front of him. No training manual that covered this, no protocol that accounted for a dog standing at a fence as if the person he had buried hours ago was somehow on the other side. "This does not make sense," he muttered under his breath. But even as he said it, the words felt hollow, because something about this moment refused to be dismissed. The air carried a weight now, subtle but undeniable, like the pause before something important is spoken, and Shadow lowered himself slowly to the ground, not in defeat, not in exhaustion, but in patience, the same patience he had learned over years of waiting for the right command, the right moment, his eyes never leaving the building, his body relaxed but ready, as if he had reached the place he was meant to be, and all that remained was time. And inside, Lucas's hand shifted again, more clearly this time, fingers curling inward before relaxing, his head tilting ever so slightly against the pillow, a movement so small it could have been missed if not for the way it broke the stillness that had held him for so long. And somewhere between that room and the quiet road outside, something passed between them, unseen, unspoken, but undeniable, A recognition that had not needed sight to exist, only connection, only the kind of bond that does not end when the world says it should. And as the last light of day faded into the horizon, leaving the building wrapped in a dim, quiet glow, Shadow remained exactly where he was, not lost, not confused, but certain, because for the first time since the earth closed over that casket, he was no longer searching, he had found him. The night settled slowly around the building, wrapping it in a quiet that felt deliberate, as if even the world outside understood that something fragile was unfolding within those walls, the faint hum of electricity and distant ventilation blending into a low, constant rhythm that never fully disappeared, and Shadow remained at the fence, unmoving, his body stretched along the ground, but his eyes wide and fixed, reflecting the dim lights beyond the glass like small, steady flames. The handler stood a few feet behind him now, arms folded loosely but no longer trying to intervene, because whatever line had been crossed, it could not be undone by pulling on a leash or calling out a command. It had become something else entirely, something that demanded patience rather than control, and inside, the room that held Lucas felt different, not in any way that could be measured, but in the subtle shifts that only mattered if you were paying attention. The steady beeping of the monitor remained unchanged, the soft rise and fall of his chest continued in quiet intervals, but there was a tension now beneath the stillness, like a surface barely holding back movement. His fingers curled again, this time lingering in that position before slowly relaxing. And then it happened, small enough to be missed, but real. His eyelids flickered, just once, a brief, uncertain movement, as if something inside him had reached the edge of waking and then pulled back. The nurse passing by the doorway paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she glanced at the monitor, then at Lucas. Sensing the change without fully understanding it, she stepped closer, her movements careful, quiet, as if approaching something that might vanish if disturbed. "Sir," she said softly, though she knew he could not hear her, her voice carrying a gentleness shaped by habit, by years of speaking to those who could not answer. And outside, Shadow's ears lifted again, his head rising slowly from the ground, his gaze sharpening with a focus that had not wavered but now seemed to deepen, as if the distance between them had shortened even more. His body tensed slightly, not in fear, not in uncertainty, but in anticipation. The handler noticed it immediately, his breath catching as he watched the dog shift, because this was not random, this was not chance, this was a response, a connection that defied explanation. And then Shadow stood, slowly, deliberately, stepping closer to the fence until the metal pressed lightly against his chest, his nose lifting toward the building as he drew in a long, steady breath. And for the first time since he had arrived, he made a sound that was neither bark nor growl, but something softer, something almost like a call carried just beneath the surface. And inside the room, Lucas's eyelids flickered again, longer this time, his brow tightening faintly as if reacting to something just beyond his awareness, his hand shifting once more, fingers curling inward with more strength than before, and the nurse straightened slightly, her eyes widening just enough to betray the change she was witnessing. She reached for the edge of the bed, her voice a little firmer now. "Can you hear me?" she asked, leaning closer, and though there was no answer, not yet, the stillness had already been broken. Something had begun, something that refused to remain buried beneath silence. And outside, under the dim glow of the fading lights, Shadow did not move again. He simply stood there, steady, certain, as if he had always known that this moment would come, not because he understood how, but because he had never accepted that it would not. It did not happen all at once, not like a sudden miracle or a dramatic return, but in the quiet, almost invisible way that life chooses to come back when no one is looking for it too closely. Inside the room, the nurse leaned in, her breath held without realizing it, her eyes fixed on Lucas as his eyelids trembled again, longer this time, more certain, and then slowly, as if pushing through something heavy and distant, they opened, just a fraction at first, enough to let in the soft light above him, enough to prove that the stillness had been broken, his gaze unfocused, drifting, not yet aware of where he was or how much time had passed, but alive in a way that could no longer be denied. The nurse stepped back quickly now, her voice steady but urgent as she reached for the call button. her training taking over even as something deeper stirred beneath it, because moments like this were rare, fragile, and never guaranteed, and outside, beyond walls and wires and everything that should have kept them apart. Shadow lifted his head fully, his body straightening as if a signal had reached him at last, his ears forward, his eyes bright with something that had not been there before, not grief, not searching, but certainty fulfilled. He let out a soft sound, low and steady, the kind of sound that comes when something lost is finally found. And for the first time since the cemetery, his tail moved with quiet intention, not wild, not uncontrolled, just a slow, deliberate motion that spoke of recognition, of knowing. The handler felt it before he understood it, a shift in the air, in the dog, in himself, his breath catching as he stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper, "What did you find?" But Shadow did not turn, did not need to answer, because the answer was already unfolding beyond the fence, inside the room where Lucas's eyes struggled to focus, blinking slowly as the world returned to him in fragments. Light, sound, the faint presence of someone nearby, and then something else, something deeper, something familiar that did not belong to the room at all. His brow tightened slightly, his gaze shifting as if searching for a point beyond the ceiling, beyond the walls, as if trying to follow a thread he could not see but somehow still felt. His lips parted just enough to form a breath that carried more than air, something close to a word, though it did not fully emerge. And yet it was enough to bridge the distance in a way no one else could understand. Outside, Shadow stepped back from the fence, not in retreat, but in completion, his body relaxing for the first time since he had arrived, the tension leaving him in a slow, quiet release. He turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at the handler, and in that look there was no confusion, no question, only calm, as if to say it is done. The handler exhaled, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his shoulders lowering as the weight of uncertainty shifted into something else, something that did not need explanation to be real. And as the night settled fully around them, the building no longer felt distant or unknown. It felt connected, part of a story that had refused to end when it was told to, because some bonds do not break when the world writes them off. They wait, they hold, they endure quietly until the moment they are needed again. And in that moment, without fanfare, without announcement, one man opened his eyes, and one dog finally stopped waiting. A 34-year-old white male U.S. Marine with rugged features, short military haircut, light stubble, wearing worn combat uniform and dog tags, standing front view, serious expression, natural lighting, realistic skin texture, cinematic style, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. A 6-year-old German Shepherd K9, with sable coat, strong muscular build, alert ears, amber eyes, standing full body front view, calm focused posture, realistic fur texture, natural lighting, cinematic detail. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration.